So next we're going to turn for the final presentation before lunch, and Ben Smith from Arup, who's the Director of Energy, Cities and Climate Change. And Arup works in more than 140 countries around the world on issues like climate change. So Ben's going to draw some best practice in climate action planning from that work. Ben.
So my name's Ben Smith. I'm a director in Arup. I've been environmental consultant for nearly 20 years now, always focusing on research, policy and development planning around sustainable development and climate change. I've been with Arup for 3 years and I lead our global partnership with C40 cities. And so, yeah, Peter just asked me to speak today to share a few thoughts about best practice climate action planning, and I'm going to do that, but very much agree with some of the points that Linda was just making about how appropriate this is in some parts of the world. My presentation today is really going to be focused on the UK environment, where I'm doing a lot of work at the moment. I wanted to just share with you all, though, a story, because it was really fascinating to see Rachel talk about the example of the power purchase agreement in the city of Melbourne this morning. I lived and worked there for 5 years earlier on in my career, and for one job I went around to all of those businesses with a survey asking them whether they'd be happy to work with each other to procure power together. So it's really brilliant to see projects like that, which take a long time to come through, starting to happen around the world. So look, my presentation today I framed around 4 simple things: why, what, who, and when. So I think I'm speaking to the converted today. You probably already are all on board with the why. Have my slides moved?
No.
Oh, this is so frustrating. Oh, they have now. Okay. So yeah, I mean, there's a climate emergency, so we're all very much aware of that. And Rachel's talked very articulately about the idea that we all, as individuals and cities, want to contribute our fair share to the emission reduction that we know is required under the Paris Agreement. And in many cities and local authorities, countries, we're also wanting to kind of work with within the broader policy landscape that exists. So in the UK at the moment, many local authorities and towns really wanting to get involved in this and get on with it because of the national level commitment they're seeing around things like the 10-point plan and the 6th carbon budget in the UK. Many cities also as well, I know that the focus today is about emissions and mitigation, but many cities are also thinking about their climate risks and wanting to respond to that. And there are some really great synergies between risks and mitigation actions when we start to think about the benefits that some of these actions can deliver in our towns and cities. And also, my final point is, I think that it's really an interesting way, climate action planning, to engage with communities at grassroots level in towns and cities to understand local issues and to help articulate to them how the climate action plan and the actions and the interventions that we want to promote can help them, and vice versa, how they can support to make those interventions right for them. It was interesting to see Simon also put a 9-point plan this morning for Malmo when he talked about his climate action plan. This is a 9-point plan that Arup produced, aimed at UK local authorities quite recently. And there's lots of different variations of these kind of 6 or 9 or 10-point plans with all slightly different words, but you get the picture. They kind of talk about a process that you have to go through. And I really wanted just to articulate in this slide that the plan itself is only 1 point in a quite long journey, as I was just mentioning when I talk about Melbourne. So we often have a bit of a celebration when we do get a plan across the line and published, but actually that's really just the starting point. It's kind of showing some intent, and the effort really starts after that in terms of working out who needs to come together, which stakeholders, who has the power, where the funding sits, where you can go for more funding to deliver on those climate action plans, and then to monitor the progress both in reducing emissions and increasing resilience to the climate risks that you've identified. I think this is a point that often gets lost when we talk specifically about planning and climate action planning. So what needs to go into a climate action plan? Well, we've heard a lot about this morning about the emissions imperative in reducing emissions, and there are different approaches that cities and places are taking to consider what emissions get considered within the plan. And Rachel talked a little bit about some of C40's pioneering research in the consumption-based space. And I think if the focus is on best practice, the best practice places are starting to now consider consumption-based emissions within their plan. But as a minimum, we would expect all places that are developing a plan to at least consider a trajectory for reducing their production-based emissions. In addition to understanding the baseline emissions, whether that's on production or consumption, they need to set a trajectory to get to zero, and that needs to have targets related to that trajectory for different sectors, and they should ideally be timestamped so that you have an idea of by when you need to get to those targets. The diagram on the left-hand side here is taken from the City of London, a piece of work we just completed. Really interesting to see them looking quite in a lot of detail at the Scope 3 consumption-based emissions. It's really interesting when you start to look at the variation in the way that cities are tackling that issue. There's 15 or so categories under the Science Based Targets Initiative. Very, very little consistency between the ways that that's being approached. Lots of people cherry picking which categories they're going to measure and then report against. I wanted to pick up and make a similar point to Linda, actually, in relation to the right scale. I mean, obviously, C40 and Rachel would be promoting cities, and I'm a big fan of cities too. But you know, these action plans actually exist at lots of different scales, and the right scale very much relates to that wider kind of multi-level governance that Linda was talking about. And at the moment in Arup, we're doing work for the World Bank to consider how urban climate action should be embedded within national level NDCs. We've got a piece of work going on, I think relevant today in South Wales, looking across 14 local authorities, so really taking a region. There's cities, we do a lot of work with cities, local authorities in the UK, and increasingly, even sub-local authority levels, we're doing a lot of work with towns through the UK Towns Fund to help them articulate where their baseline emissions are and where they need to be heading towards, and then to start preparing funding propositions for interventions that can be funded by the Towns Fund. I spoke a little bit about risks, and I don't think we should overlook that. I know the session today is on mitigation, but the best practice climate action plans are also including risks, articulating what risks they expect in different time points in the future. This is a City of Bristol strategy, and then identifying actions that can build resilience to those risks. And I think that becomes particularly relevant in this conversation when we come later to talk about how we prioritize actions and consider the co-benefits between them. So in terms of the prioritization of actions, I'm not going to talk about the climate interventions themselves, as has been really well covered by Simon and Rachel and Linda, but actually just to go through a process of describing how you might go about prioritizing what you do and in what order. I mean, our recent experience is that pretty much everything you can think of needs to happen if you're going to deliver the targets that you're setting out. But we still live in a world where funding is required to make things happen, and there is, generally speaking, an order in which it's best to go about delivering these actions. So how might you go about doing that? We try to work out the carbon benefit of these different interventions we describe. We work out the cost, both in terms of capital and life cycle cost, and specifically looking at maintenance. We look, especially in the context of the COVID recovery, we look at jobs and economic benefits, and that's something that's a real focus for us in our work in Istanbul at the moment. And we also think about those co-benefits, as Rachel described, or the collaboration opportunities. So where might there be an opportunity to partner with another actor that's active in your city to drive forward on one of these actions or more? And look, what I would say is that collecting all that evidence together in a perfect way is not always a perfect science. It doesn't always come together as you would hope, and sometimes you do have to rely on a judgment. But nevertheless, I think it's important to try and stick to some kind of process, because that helps to build consensus and then ultimately get your plan actions implemented. In going through that prioritization process, I think it's important to also, as I was saying earlier, to think about where the power sits for delivering those actions. I always open a plan and I go to the place where the actions are listed out, and if I can't see who's accountable, which stakeholders are involved, I kind of say put the plan to one side and say it's probably not the best example. You know, you want to be seeing in next to each action, these are the key actors that need to come together to make that action happen. I wanted to talk a little bit about implementation and monitoring, because this is something which is, you know, really starting to come to the fore now, and it links back to my previous slide where I said that the plan was just the first step. We often finish commissions where we're employed to write the plan, and then we get a call a month or 6 weeks, 2 months later to say we don't know what to do next. We don't know how to move to the implementation phase. There's a whole kind of governance set up in terms of organising yourselves, working out task groups, steering group committees, and so on, to make sure that you're tracking progress in each of the action areas that you've identified, and setting KPIs and indicators that can help you to report your progress. And I would say the best practice places, the ones that are doing this really well, would be releasing an annual report, even if it's just a page long, just to show you the progress that they've made on the plan that they published this time last year, and areas for improvement, perhaps areas that have stopped because there wasn't enough funding and therefore need to be prioritized going forward. So that was the sort of what I think needs to be included in the plan. In terms of who and who to involve, I mean, this is a really interesting topic at the moment, because we're seeing so many different approaches to engaging citizens in the process of plan making, and at different stages. So often we're seeing citizens' assemblies where people are coming together to inform what goes into the plan, and then we're also seeing groups of people being pulled together to work as a task force for delivering and implementing the actions that are included in the plan. The pictures on the slide here, so there's David Attenborough and Chris Stark in the UK Climate Assembly, which I'm sure you saw in the news a few months back. The one in the middle people might not recognise. This is an old shop in Camden, which is close to where the Arup office is when we're in the office, and they took that place over and did it out and made it basically like a drop-in centre for anyone who is in the area to come and have a conversation about what they thought was important in terms of the climate action and broader sustainability issues. And they were constantly having someone there taking notes, and you know, really interesting. So I went there a few times in a lunch break, just have a chat, see who I met, see what they were interested in, see what sorts of conversations were popping up. But really interesting just to kind of bring a broader community of people together around this kind of concept. And the last picture there at the bottom is at a C40 Mayor Summit in Copenhagen, and really just to make the point that, you know, we often think when planning, you know, it's quite a tried and tested profession, often like lots of slightly middle-aged or older people who have been, you know, doing this for a long time, writing these plans, all based on real evidence. But actually the youth voice is super important now, and it will be that generation that's got the passion to drive these things forward. So bringing those guys in and perhaps giving them a way to kind of put their activism into something which they can then get behind and where they live, I think is an opportunity that lots of cities and places are getting on board with us, as says on the slide here. The Manchester, the combined authority there, have set up the Youth Combined Authority as well. The point around bringing people together, that needs to happen after the plan's developed as well. And I wanted to use this example from London just to make the point about these documents aren't necessarily just setting out the actions that you have direct control to deliver yourself as an authority. They're often used for advocacy as well. And if you speak to the Deputy Mayor for Environment in London, and on this topic, she will often explain that this is our plan, and these are the bits of it that we're going to do, but these are the bits everybody else needs to do. And it actually links back to the point Linda was making about how you engage business in this process, because I am increasingly believing now that in order to deliver a city level or a town or local authority level climate action plan, what you really need to do is build a community of actors across multiple different stakeholders, whether that's utilities, business, government, private sector, community and NGOs, who kind of come together and work on the plan as one. And we saw that model, I guess, becoming more and more relevant as we worked on the consumption-based emissions research with C40 last year, where it does, I think, you know, because the emissions are not produced where you live, it's going to change, you know, require behavioural changes. It's going to require changes in the way that businesses procure their goods and services and so on, we thought this model becomes increasingly relevant in that context. Look, I wasn't completely sure of what the audience might be today, but I thought that some people on the call might be in the process of delivering a climate action plan or involved in them, and I just thought it'd be worth sharing some of the places where we frequently go to get guidance and support, because there's absolutely loads of stuff that's been written on this topic. It's not hard to get hold of the information. You can find data on energy use in UK local authorities from BEIS. You can find data on climate risk from the UK CP, the Met Office projections from 2018. And lots of local authorities at local level have better, more granular data that you can draw on in discussion with them. There's lots of literature out there which explains what sort of carbon saving you might get from different types of interventions at different scale and what that might cost. There's guidance from C40. I was hearing on a call this morning that there might soon be published a sort of a best practice table of contents for a climate action plan by C40, so that might be something to look out for. Arup is producing these documents which are out there free in the public domain. You can go and search for on the internet, which talk through the process a little bit. And we've done lots of things which kind of point you to toolkits and approaches for engaging citizens. So this piece of work with Rachel's team on inclusive climate action has like a catalogue of different tools and approaches to engage citizens in this process. So I suppose I'm going to finish pretty much where I started with the sort of Melbourne story, really. It is urgent, and we do need to act now, all of us in whatever capacity we can. But it's also ongoing, and none of the change actually happens immediately, and it takes a sort of sustained effort over many years to get some of these projects going. And as I said, you've got to kind of think about I think you've got to think in that context of what it is that you can drive forward yourself within your organization, and then where you need to kind of pull other levers to help other people deliver on their actions or deliver actions jointly with you. And Rachel and others have spoken about the sort of need to decarbonise the broader grid, which is obviously often outside of the control of the individual local authority, town or city. And things like building regulations, I think, are coming back round for review soon. And clearly those kind of national level things are critically important in driving emissions down everywhere, certainly in the UK sense. So look, I have a bit of a shaky start there, Peter, with the script slides. I lost a bit of time, but I think I'll get you back on track. I wanted to finish by saying that if anyone wants to get in touch, we do a lot of this work all over the world. We know there's fantastic resources out there that might help people if they're just getting started on this. So if you want to drop me a line, I can share references through, as I'm sure Rachel and others will too. Because there's quite a lot of material that kind of guide people through this process of making a climate action plan. And remember, once the plan is there, that's just the start. Thank you.
And thank you so much, for setting out really how to do it and how it's doable with support. So really, really helpful.